Welcome to our June 2024 edition of the Idaho Department of Labor's Labor Market Insights series. My name is Lindsay Trombley, and I am the Public Information Specialist at the Idaho Department of Labor and your host today. Today, labor economist Jan Roeser will provide an overview of 2022 data from the U.S. Census of Agriculture. We also have Ben Johnson here with us today, who is the Idaho State statistician for the National Agriculture Statistics Service of the USDA. So Ben, why don't you kind of start and just introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you. Again, I'm Ben Johnson with National Agricultural Statistics Service, representative for our agency here in Idaho. I've been with the agency for 15 years, 4 years here in Idaho, and previously in Washington, D.C., California, Oregon, and Utah. Our business is collecting and publishing agricultural data in service to U.S. agriculture. And we're talking about today the 2022 Census of Agriculture, which was recently released back in February, which the Census of Agriculture has been actually conducted back since 1840 with, I think, 26 states and including the District of Columbia. The Census of Agriculture, it's a complete count taken every 5 years of American farms, ranches, and the people who operate those farms and ranches. So we get a lot of demographic information, over 1 million data points, sliced in all kinds of different directions. I've been involved mostly in 2023 in processing a lot of that data, and I'm part of the team of the Northwest region out of Olympia is our headquarters in this region. So our team of about 33, 34 staff plugging away at the Northwest census data to bring you these products, and you'll see some of the results today. And thanks for having me.
Thanks, Ben. I'm going to jump right in, and I will preface my presentation by saying I so look forward to this every 5 years. It is a photograph of what's going on in the agricultural sector, and it only occurs on those years that start or end with a 2 or a 7. And so I'm always very excited. I'm gleeful almost, and I do contact Ben. I had to clarify a few things for this presentation, and they are ever so helpful. So I'm really excited to have you on and to kind of throw some ideas around. I have ideas of what causes things, and it's not always a cause and effect. So it's really nice to have somebody that brings a little reality to the situation. When you say there's millions of data points, you're exactly right. And it could take 5 years until I would work through all of these. But I have pulled out ones that I have found extremely interesting, particularly to Idaho. And I'd also like to preface the presentation by saying sometimes we forget that the base of our economy was agriculture, but it's still a huge part of Idaho's economy, even as we have diversified. It is a wealth building industry, and it is something that keeps all of our rural counties afloat, honestly. And you will see some of that in the numbers here. So let's delve right in. See if I can get our slides to move forward. I've stolen a couple of slides from the University of Idaho, Idaho's grant, or our land grant university that handles not only the extension agents across our state that help our producers, but it also does the research and development facilities that are also sprinkled across Idaho's landscape, particularly in the south, where most of our agricultural activities occur. And you'll also see that in some of the data. Every year at the legislators' Economic Revenue and Outlook Committee, the University of Idaho's agricultural economists pull together what they think is going to happen with the next year, but also what happened in that immediate year, because we all know that all of this data has a lag period. A lot of information comes from tax returns. A lot of information comes from unemployment insurance reports. A lot of information comes obviously from the National Agricultural Service statistics. But somehow the University of Idaho is able to compile that for the committee. And these slides are very compelling, in my opinion. They show that in 2022, Idaho would be ranked 38th smallest as far as their gross domestic product. But when it comes to their farm gross domestic product, all of a sudden they jump up in ranking to 17th. We're not a large state population-wise at 2 million, but we have some really strong agricultural economies going. And we're 5th in ag gross domestic product as a percent of our total product. So some of the smaller states will show that because their total gross domestic product, the denominator, isn't that big. South Dakota, North Dakota, they're smaller states like Idaho, but they're still gangbusters in agriculture. And you can see that Idaho is 5th behind South Dakota, North Dakota, Iowa, and Nebraska. Iowa and Nebraska, of course, are larger population states. Idaho's agribiz, which would include all of our food processing, our non-durable manufacturing, it comes out as 17% of all of our output. And so that's another modeling that University of Idaho has been able to tease out that figure, and they compare it with high-tech manufacturing, which some of our semiconductor chip manufacturing and research and development that supports that. We have more than one semiconductor chip manufacturer in Idaho. We have several. And so agribiz is 17% compared to these very, very big industries as far as gross output at 7%. The jobs come in at 12%. GDP is at 12.5% is what they're saying for ag. So it makes up 12.5% of everything for just the gross domestic product.
And
The next,
oh, sorry,
yeah,
Jan.
that's all right. Jump in there.
No, if you wanted to contrast that too in nation, I think it's roughly around 0.7% agriculture, farming and ranching impacting the GDP nationally. But if you factor in food services and all the entities that use agricultural products in their products, textile and food services and groceries and markets, it gets over 5% of the national GDP. So,
wow.
Farming itself, is a small under 1%, but how it's used throughout the nation and throughout the world, it's a big impact.
It is. And when you talk about the world, that's another thing. I didn't even go into exports, but Idaho has huge exports of their raw products and some of their value-added products too. So yeah, good commentary. I wanted to jump into this slide before the second University of Idaho slide. Idaho spuds topped by dairy. This doesn't mean that sour cream is on top of our baked potatoes. What that means is that our dairy products have now gotten a larger market receipts, total market receipts than potatoes. Potatoes is now our #2 agricultural product behind dairy. And so you'll see that these are some of our retro license plates. I was wondering if we have one for dairy cows, and we might. You can see that University of Idaho has split that out. Cattle and calves is more the beef cattle part of it. And then we have the dairy cows over here and the milk products that are derived from that don't necessarily show up in this particular slide. They will show up in our total domestic gross product. But you can see that potatoes used to be our #1 crop. Everybody knew Idaho for its spuds, but quite frankly, there's still a large component. There's a huge supply chain that feeds into it. There's a lot of implements that are needed to do potato farming. And you'll also see some of the labor that accompanies a lot of these crops. Will have Ben help us identify some of these market receipts that are high in certain areas. So we also want to comment that hay is really really caught up with wheat. Part of that is the fact that we need a lot of feed, corn, grains for our dairy cows and our beef cattle cows at times too when we're fattening them. So, there's really a synergy going on. The sugar beets are there at 5%. We have plants scattered across southern Idaho, one in Nampa, one in Paul, one in Twin Falls. And I think there might be one more. I could be wrong about that. I don't, maybe Power County doesn't have one, but certainly all along that Snake River, we have myriad crops that are being farmed and produced. And it's pretty exciting. At one point in time, South Central Idaho came up with the lingo that they're the food basket of America because there's such a diversity of crops that are raised there, including they're the #1 trout producers. They have the sugar beets, they have the potatoes, they have the dairy cows. The litany goes on. They even go into bullfrog legs. So there really is some diversity there. Getting back to our milk cows, though, that just seems to be some of our biggest. You can see 31% in the previous slide. Idaho used to be fairly flat as far as milk production and really started to rise in the 90s when dairies from California migrated over to Idaho. And that's about the time that it doesn't even look like California lost any ground, but they did lose some, and you can see it flattening out right here. There's just not a big growth there because of some of the environmental things, but also they have a much denser population there. You can see Wisconsin was always the leader. It crossed paths in the 90s, and all of a sudden California took over. These are such greater producers than Idaho. We will probably never, ever catch up. But we are #3, and you can see it right here. We've vied with New York State for quite some time, but typically we have a little bit higher production per dairy cow than New York State does. And so this is all about cows, though. Idaho has 665,000 dairy cows, and that doesn't include the replacement heifers that are calves. So we're really a big producer. You can see that Texas is starting to grow. Who knows? Maybe they'll usurp New York. We don't know what'll happen in Idaho. We assume that we will keep expanding. The big joke over in South Central Idaho is that every time a dairyman has a new grandson, there's going to be a new dairy popping up because they're going to take care of that grandson or granddaughter. I shouldn't say grandson. Here's the dairy cows broken out by region in Idaho. So where Ben does his work, and also health and welfare, I think they have different numbers of regions than labor does. We have 6 regions. We try to staff each of our 6 regions with regional economists. In this particular graph, you won't see anything in region 1 and 2. They just really don't have enough to even show on this slide. And even region 5 and 6 is a little lower. These are ideal conditions for dairy cattle. We have industrial sized dairies that are managing to get the ultimate production out of each and every cow there. So certainly dairy probably started in southwestern Idaho. Meridian was a big dairy producer at one time. Meridian is now producing subdivisions and people, and that's part of some of the confrontations sometimes in Idaho is land use, and do we want our farmland or our grazing land to be turned into subdivisions? And we see some of that pull going on all the time throughout our state. Here's our beef cattle, subset of livestock. Once again, what did you say, Ben? How many total livestock are there across Idaho?
Yeah, if you combine the beef and dairy industry together, we're up at about 2.5 million head of cattle. And whereas in 2022, what was it? I think human population was around 1.9 million, almost at 2 million. So yeah, more cows than people in Idaho. And
For sure. And we ship a lot out. We don't produce food in Idaho. We don't produce crops, livestock, just to feed us. We're feeding basically the world, and a lot of our exports go out the door. This is the beef cattle breakdown, and so every one of our regions has some beef cattle. Ben, when you're doing your census of ag, what is the threshold that you consider to be a farming operation, to be a farm?
Yeah, so we do try and make sure everyone at least gets an opportunity to be represented if they are a farm. So sometimes we overreach to the population, but yeah, it's pretty low and hasn't been changed, I think, since the 70s. But if you produce $1,000 or more in agricultural product sales, or normally would have during the census year, in this case 2022, then you qualify as a farm. So you know, some people are right around that mark, and should they be qualified as a farm or not? We there's a lot of small farms, and it's hard to weed through some of those, but we try and make sure to include the right ones and exclude the ones that should be in the population as well.
Yeah, sometimes even the hobby farmers really grow their herd a little bit bigger than they originally thought they were going to. It gets to be fun, and sometimes it gets to be pretty profitable, especially if you have kids in 4-H that are paying for college with those fattened steers or various things. But yeah, here we are, Northern Idaho. Once again, Northern Idaho isn't the biggest contributor to the ag industry, but certainly we see that Region 3 is the biggest beef cattle region, and Region 4 is second. In the previous slide, we saw Region 4, which is the Twin Falls greater area. There's 8 counties there. They're really strong in dairy. Not quite as strong, but still second as far as beef cattle goes. And then we have over here, eastern part of the state and southeastern. This shows the share of Idaho's area. So Idaho is about 53 million acres. We're a pretty large state. We're certainly not the top 5 or the top 10, but we're up there. Of those 53 million, 11.5 million acres were counted as being dedicated to farming operations in 2022 for that census. So you can see in previous census, this shows maybe about 20 years worth of data, that it started at 22.3%. So it had a higher share, really dropped down in 2007 when we were starting to really build subdivisions across southern Idaho, even into Region 4, Twin Falls. All of the areas were really growing. And then the Great Recession hit, and that put a screech on that. A lot of times we found that land was planned for a subdivision, but all of a sudden the skids are put on any new building. People just didn't see the economic benefit of doing a new subdivision at that point. Housing market had pretty much came to a halt. And so a lot of the farm land that was going to be a subdivision might have been put back into production just to make it viable, just to make, or even if it sat fallow a little bit, but was still considered farmland for tax advantages. We saw a little bit of that because you can see it rises back up again in the next 5 years in 2012 when buildings started to come back a little bit. So 22.2 in 2012, 22.1. Still the trend is kind of up and down, kind of more down than up, but it does follow the economy to an extent. This shows our loss of farm rate in the surrounding areas compared to Idaho. So we know that we lost a little bit over 2,000 farms. Most of those were dedicated to crops, and Idaho lost 8.5% of their farms. But we see that most of our neighbors, our contiguous neighbors, Wyoming, Washington, Montana, Nevada, and Utah, all, except for Utah, all had greater losses than Idaho did as far as percentage change. And some of these neighbors, Utah's an example. Utah has a pretty diversified economy. It has a lot of tourism, a lot of public lands like Idaho, but it also has a lot of mining. It has a lot of finance. It has a lot going on in that regard. Nevada has mining. Montana and Wyoming have energy and some mining. So, you know, there's different things going on. Washington is a big ag producer and a big agribusiness as far as the food manufacturing, the food processing plants too. But it did show that same downward trend. So we're not alone. And this is going on across the nation, isn't it, Ben? I mean, this isn't unusual, is it?
No, yeah, it's kind of been the trend from each census. Um, Even though I think Idaho had a slight uptick from 12 to 17,
Mhm.
but nationally, yeah, we've just slowly been trending down. A little bigger jump, it seemed like, in the last 5 years than previous census jumps.
Mhm. Here's the acres harvested just in the last, you know, comparing this census with the last census. You can see that we lost just a little over 200,000 acres. And when you're looking at that previous, well, no, this previous slide, uh, these this share of farmland, it's all pretty similar. I've really scaled it down so you see big changes, but it's really pretty similar. You're going to see maybe 200,000 acre changes, maybe 300,000 at the most. But in the big scheme of things, with 11.5 million acres in farm production, that's not a big deal. So it is a loss, though, 4.5%. And then just our cropland. And I am going to ask Ben for a little bit of explanation on this, because we do look at the census and it says certain land is cropland, and then it doesn't really provide another category. So if you don't mind explaining that a little bit.
Yes, we do have a breakout at land, like land and pasture. And actually,
Okay.
Idaho has quite a bit of pasture land that wouldn't be included here under cropland. There's about a little over 5 million acres in pasture, which is about 43% of Idaho's farmland.
Okay.
Now, keep in mind too, that doesn't include public-private grazing land, which Idaho is friendly to the ranchers for grazing land. And so there's a lot more even of the 53 million acres that in the state that are used that we aren't picking up here as farmland. And also there's some cases where cropland could be planted, but maybe they've put it aside for fallow or conservation purposes. And so, you know, crop rotations, it may have not been included there too. But yeah, you can
So
see
some
drops and increases, you know, from year to year occasionally.
Right. So some of these farms, these are actual loss of farms, but some of this can be reclassification too, you said.
Yeah,
Sometimes,
some of
you
it,
know,
yeah.
yeah. Mainly between the counties, though, probably not by the state. And we're looking at the state at this point. So, okay. And here's acreage size. I thought it was interesting to look at the change by the size of the farm. And this is where potentially things can move into different categories. And they can also move, as I mentioned, into other counties too, because a lot of times farmers farm in 2 or 3 different counties. Maybe they're all close together. But in this particular one, we're looking at where did we lose and where did we gain? And so the lighter green is the really large farms that we have in Idaho, 1,000 acres plus. And you can see that this particular column doesn't look all that different. It looks like it's gotten maybe a little bit smaller, but not much over time. This is over a 25-year time period. The biggest change is in the smallest. So they have the greatest volatility. It seems like it was really quite large in 97, really dropped down by 2002, stayed about the same for 2007, 2012, but then popped up again in 2017. And 2022, it's come down a little bit. I think maybe it has something to do with some of the folks that are coming into our state, moving in and deciding they want to give this a try, or maybe they're coming from a state where they did that, but they want to do it on a smaller basis. Maybe they're retired and they want to keep maybe a couple of steers or a couple of alpacas. That's kind of what I always think would be fun, something really interesting. I grew up on a farm, and it wasn't always the most interesting because it was a small farm. So everybody worked, and I'm going to address that in another slide about workers. But the purple is a pretty good sized farm, but you can see that these are showing some consolidation as well over the years. And so the economies of scale are really showing up as people condense a little bit more, as the farmers decide maybe they want to sell, or maybe they want to, if they do have children that want to join in, maybe they want to have maybe a little bit larger. You can see some of the very smaller ones get smaller, and the larger ones stay about the same. But it does seem like, from what you've seen, Ben, it seems like across the nation, bigger is better, it seems like, in farming.
Yeah, we might talk about this a little bit later, but just, there's some hard things to take away from the census data, but there's some good things too. And,
Yeah.
farmer efficiencies. So we sometimes, even in our line of work, we're forced to do a little more with less, right? And
Absolutely.
that's falling in the agricultural industry too. And still expected to feed a growing world population, but less farms and less farmland to do it on. They're having to be innovative, and they are doing that, and they're adapting and doing the best they can still with the land they oversee.
Right. And I think it's really fascinating too how much farmers, sometimes people think it's kind of an outdated industry, but it's one of the most automated and mechanized, and it really stays on top of the latest trends. Yeah.
The technology is definitely impressive when you go out and visit dairies and farms, and yeah.
Oh yeah, I have a friend that has one of those dry, hands-free. I think he does custom cutting of hay, and he has to entertain himself as he goes down the rows because it's driving itself. Then he has to turn it around, and that's his big contribution, is the turnaround part of it. But yeah, those implements cost a lot of money, and I actually included a slide about that because I do think it's part of farming, the financing of all the equipment, and you have to have the land. It's not for somebody just to pop into. They almost have to have it in their family to make it worthwhile, because you have to have some knowledge about it, but it helps to have the land in place and to have the equipment. It really is something that's a treasure to pass on to the next generation. But I think a lot of farmers have found their next generation has other ideas on how they want to spend their working days. And so they're running into some issues with that. Here's
Hey,
farms.
Jan.
Oh, yes.
Sorry to interrupt. We just have a quick question in the chat relating to your last slide.
Okay.
They're just wondering, are the farm sizes, acres farmed, including leased land or acres owned?
I would guess it's leased, but what does Ben say?
Both. So it's acres operated. So whether you own it or you're leasing it. So it's quite an ordeal to sort out who's leasing the land and who's the leaseor, and yeah, we make sure we're not trying to not double count those rented acres. But yeah, it does include what you're operating, which includes owned and leased land.
And I think a lot of farmers do lease, because there's times that it's just silly if there's a piece of ground right there, right next to something you're doing. Why not just pick it up and include it in the mix if it's just sitting there? So, yeah.
And we talk about some operators, getting old up there in age and may not want to quite get rid of the farm, so they'll lease it out to a neighbor or a friend or family member and still have some ownership there and until they're ready to make a final decision.
Yeah, and that's got to be hard because that's kind of your legacy. How, I have to say, I don't think agriculture is for the faint of heart, but it's not necessarily a job, it's a lifestyle. And I think that's what you're finding. People don't want to necessarily be tied to that if they grew up with it. Some do, some still love it, but yeah, you have some mixed results among your kids. Here's by the value of sales. So, definitely we can see that there's a lot of farms that are in that smaller category of production. So they're wanting to have some acreage. They want to feel like they're out in the country, but they don't really farm 40 acres or 50 acres of a crop. They're maybe doing some livestock, or maybe they're doing a farm with some organic. I mean, there's just all sorts of things they could be doing. And then you can see that really one of the most popular is the 100,000 to 499,000, because the sales are only part of the component, right? You have to take away your expenses, and so you have to have enough to feed at least one family, and maybe if you're a family farm, you have another brother or another child that's one of your offspring that are helping you with it. So 100,000 to 500,000 is something that once you take away the expenses, maybe you could handle doing that, and then definitely the 500,000 or more is out there. But there's a lot of popular, just augmenting. I think your survey also asked the question, do you have outside work? And a lot of the farmers do have outside work. So this
Majority,
is
yeah.
it's a side gig, and I didn't make a slide for that. I couldn't make a slide for everything, but yeah, the majority do have a lot. Here's large. This was a big aha moment for me. If I were to choose my aha moment, I was absolutely flabbergasted that southeastern Idaho, which is Pocatello, Bear Lake, Caribou, I guess Bingham's included in that. Some of those counties over on the southeastern side of the state have the largest number of large farms. So it makes me wonder, I wonder if they're doing some dryland farming too, or if they have to have irrigation for all those large farms. Anyway.
There is some, dry land over there, but good chunk that's still irrigated too.
Yeah. And that some of that could be at risk right now, since they do have a water curtailment issue out there. South Central is next in line at almost 500. And then we have Eastern Idaho and Southwestern. So there's still a large, we've still got a lot of large farms in southern Idaho. There's a few up in North Central. And North Central has one of our largest area counties. Idaho County is really large up there. And so I'm sure there's a few farms that are there.
Yeah.
The Palouse.
Can't forget our grain growers up there.
Yeah, lots of grain growers up there. Here's Idaho farm workers by region, and then they're parsed out into hired workers, unpaid workers, and migrant workers. So the hired workers are definitely really important, especially in our key areas, our key regions. Region 3, Region 4 seem to have the largest market receipts as far as counties go. But Region 5 and Region 6 are big ag producers too. So they have hired workers. Migrant workers show in the green bar. And I asked Ben about this. We think H2A workers are included in that migrant workers because it's just pretty hard to find anybody that wants to travel, that lives in the US, that wants to work in agriculture. There's so much competition for labor force these days. I know when the Great Recession hit, California had a lot of commentary about how a lot of their ag workers had moved on to doing construction jobs, and they didn't want to go back to doing ag jobs once the construction industry's bottom fell out. So yeah, there's kind of hard to fill those jobs. We see it all the time, and I do have a slide on the H2A workers, but people probably wonder about this unpaid worker category. I mean, who would work and not get paid, right? But there's lots of family members. I was one of them when I was growing up. You did what you were told.
Right.
And sometimes it wasn't at very convenient times. I think I was driving a pickup truck in first gear at 7, and my dad was throwing bales off the back to the cows at 6 in the morning, and I was rubbing sleep out of my eyes. And yeah, unwilling potentially, but unpaid. I think I got something out of the deal, I'm sure Dad would say. But Region 4, once again, some of the most workers are found there. One of the things that is kind of a issue with a lot of producers in Idaho is that the H2A workers have to be working seasonal jobs. So the dairies don't qualify for H2A workers. And we know that there are certain workers that are working under the radar and are not documented to work in the US. And it's believed, time and time again that a lot of those migrate to the dairy industry because they need so many workers for these big farms. So, some of that's showing up probably here. These may be some undocumented workers. We don't know that. Everybody goes to great lengths to try to ensure that doesn't happen, but it's really hard. There's document making entities out there. This is basically a chart that shows you the H2A workers nationally. So you're looking at the jobs that get certified. So a farmer has to go and ask to be certified. They have to look at the type of work he's doing, where it's working. He has to make sure the job's advertised, usually with Idaho Department of Labor, and that there aren't other Americans that want to do the job. And once that occurs, then they can become certified. But then there still may not be visas issued. There might be something that comes up, maybe a conflict with the individual that was going to come. A lot of the same H2A workers keep coming back year after year. I think some people say they've had the same handful of workers for 25 years that keep coming back. But the farmer has to pay $16.54 this year an hour for an H2A worker, and they have to ensure that their transportation is paid and that they have housing. And Idaho Department of Labor checks their housing and their water to make sure that's safe and that those are good conditions for them to live in. But yeah, it's quite a process and it's quite expensive to get H2A workers, but it is what is keeping the farms going. And you can see how low it was just even, let's go back 10 years. You can see that it was under 100,000. Now it's up around 258 as far as 317 as far as certified and 258 as far as visas. So this has doubled over the last 10 years. And Idaho has had about the same thing happen. It's basically more than doubled. This is over 7,000 H2A workers come to work in the fields and the farms in Idaho versus back in 2016, it was under 3,000. So it's hard to get workers.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh,
Ben.
no, I pulled up the number of hired workers from 2002 census. We were about 50,000 and now we're down to about 43,000. Just showing over the trending down, the amount of workers available. Yeah, it's tough.
Yeah.
The data shows that. And, that's one of the purposes we do what we do is to show these trends so that, farmers can complain about it, but now their representatives and the universities and legislators can be shown the data and say, yeah, see, it's really happening. Like, you want us to continue to do what we're doing, but with less help and support. So they can see that and ask the questions of what can be done.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we know that farmers have very, very risky business plans. I mean, so much depends on things like water and weather and prices internationally, prices domestically. The expenses that go into it fluctuate, and the ability to keep your land and lease the same land that you maybe leased last year. I mean, everything's very dynamic, so they take a lot of risks. They really have to be an optimistic group, but they like to complain when things don't go right too, and so they can be very vocal.
And they should.
They should. They're feeding all of us. I've heard a quote somewhere, you know, you use a doctor, you know, maybe once a year, you use an attorney maybe once in a lifetime, but you need your farmers every 3 times a day for your 3 squares. So farm production expenses. I just wanted to go into inflation a little bit. That's been the big scar on our economy. We have a pretty rousing economy, quite frankly, except for inflation. And it's showing up here because this particular census was done in 2022 when inflation had hit pretty hard. So you can see that a lot of what comprises the biggest part of farm production is really, in this case, the feed purchase. So you can see that the livestock industry is really important to Idaho. The expenses aggregated come up to about 9.3 billion. So that's a huge subset industry of support to livestock, I mean, to all farmers. All of the rural communities have dealers that are helping them in some way, either selling them chemicals, fertilizer, uh, irrigation pipe. You start listing the things and it's just really numerous. They do get gas and fuel, usually wholesale, but it still has fluctuations in price that make it hard to estimate. And the second item, besides the fuel or the feed purchase, the second highest is farm labor. And that keeps growing. I think it grew, you know, $1 from last year, which doesn't seem like very much as far as the H2A wage. But I mean, that really adds up when you have 7,000 workers coming in, and they work really hard during the week. They don't do 40-hour weeks. This shows a little bit about expenses over time. So we're looking at the 25 years of the census data. And you can see that the prices of purchasing livestock have been relatively stable, kind of flat, but you can see that the feed purchase has just really risen, particularly in the last year, but in the last 3 cycles of 5-year census. Fertilizer is still a smaller cost. You know, both of these, the fuel is a smaller cost compared to feed, but it's still rising. Here's the farm labor. You can see it took a big jump and has done so. Interest expense isn't probably showing the latest round that occurred in 2022, but it definitely has gone up. Interest expenses were very stable, and we really haven't had a big farm crisis since 1985, when a lot of farmers lost their land, and Willie Nelson's had the big concert and raised money for everybody. That's part of the past, but we don't know what is coming, because every year a farmer or a producer has to renew their line of credit, and it's going to be more expensive this year. Here's a graph that shows you that it's indexed to 0 starting in 1997. And this is the change that has happened to each of these different expense items. And these are only select expenses. The census can't list everything, so they've grouped things into these 7 that are the overarching expenses that they have. But you can see that feed is growing by almost 5 times, 5-fold what it was in 97. These other expenses have all grown almost 3 times. In this case, in the case of fertilizer and soil conditioners, it's only grown 2 times the amount since 1997. And these have gone up, 60%. These are the interest expenses, still pretty flat over time. You can see that back here, the fertilizer and some of those expenses that grew pretty well, they were really undervalued, maybe just really coming at a good discount. In 2002, they were below zero. So there's a lot of volatility in expenses, some more so than others. And that's just what I wanted to show you in that slide. I've got to keep moving along here. Or I'm going to run out of time. I'm at 20. I have 4 more. Okay, these are the top. This is the part I really like, is seeing who's the biggest money makers by county. And you can see that the rankings have been pretty much the same. Cassia is always the biggest. This shows the amount of jump since the last census. So Cassia's market receipts for all of its products has grown by 25%, but look at Twin Falls, 67%. So they've probably taken on a few more dairies is kind of what I think, but I don't know that for sure. Gooding, 40%. You can see some of these, even though they might be lower in the rankings, they've grown a lot more since the last census, 47, 48% here for Jerome. And then as we go down lower, we can also see where some of these has switched places ranking. So in 2017, Twin Falls had a lower market receipts than Gooding did. So Gooding was ranked second. Twin Falls was ranked third. It changed places in this most recent census. And then Elmore and Bingham did the same thing. Elmore was smaller than Bingham in the last census, 2017, but now it has a larger share of market receipts. And then Minidoka really soared, and they've had more dairies, more animals out there, more milk cows. This shows how wealth building really agriculture can be. So you're seeing by county the average farm and what their net cash income is. So this is after all of those expenses, all of that inflation. And this was in 2022. Of course, once again, everything's 2022. Gooding's at the top. It has a lot of dairies. Jerome has a lot of dairies. Cassia has a lot of dairies. In fact, Ben, you had something. Did you say Cassia was?
Yeah, I'll highlight this in a little bit
That
too.
was
But we
interesting.
have county profiles, and Cassia County shows the breakout of revenue by crops and by livestock, and then you'll even break it out further into individual commodities. But the income from Cassia County is represented about 66% from livestock, poultry, and any livestock sales. Good chunk, yeah, almost pretty much 2/3 Cassia County comes from livestock.
Mm-hmm.
Product.
And I would say in the past that probably wasn't the case if we go back.
Yeah, you can go back and look at that too and
Mm-hmm.
compare. So
the turn of the century, I'm pretty sure they were more crop. I mean, livestock, the dairy cows are really growing in that area. Elmore, once again, 318. So these are all showing the top and going down smaller. And you can see we even have some of North Central with Latah up there. And some of these are very small counties. Camas is very small. Butte's pretty small counties, but still the farms that are there are bringing in a pretty good net cash income. Idaho's average is 88,000. So that's a nod to the fact that there's a lot of small farmers. Land and buildings. So the average per farm that a farmer has dedicated towards land and buildings is a little over 2 million. Machinery and equipment is at 215,000. So the level of investment is really big. And what's interesting about this too is land and building, as far as all the different counties, they range, some of them go up to 9.5 million on the high end, and they go down to 750,000 on the low end for land and buildings. Machinery and equipment, the highest is at 607,000. It's in Power County, and the lowest is in Boise County, our little mountainy area up above Ada County, at 50,000. So the machinery that's that Power County needs for all of its potatoes, and they have other row crops, is really expensive. The average farm there has over $500,000 in equipment. So some of the challenges, I just wanted to mention real quick, something that I think is a huge challenge for farmers is the fact that they don't really have a retirement. And when they do, it would be to sell their land, and most likely as a subdivision because developers pay more. But I noticed in Ben's Census of Ag that a lot of the entities you're seeing land trusts building up. So farmers are able to sell to a land trust and get a little higher money than they would if they sold to a farmer. Maybe not quite as much to a subdivision, but that land trust will be held there and somebody can come in and buy that land if they're going to farm it. And so it's pretty exciting that they're making some changes and looking at this and helping those farmers retire, because farmers overall are a little older workers, if I recall correctly. I'll let Ben add to that,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
characteristics.
Average age has been going up slightly over time. But yeah, and some of those business decisions, they're tough, but there's good resources out there to help the aging community to make the best decision for their operation. And you shout out to Idaho State Department of Agriculture and their Farm and Ranch Center. They've developed some good resources for farmers, so that's a
great.
good source for them to go to for estate planning and retirement planning and things like that. This slide here, it just kind of shows some of the products that we have released or will be releasing, continue to release from this 2022 Census of Ag data. We'll do follow-on census based off of what we pick up in the census here. We're currently working on data on irrigation and water management. You see at the bottom that we published in November. And as we do a census of aquaculture, we've already collected the data for these projects, so we're processing it now. We have a publication coming out in June on race, ethnicity, and gender profiles. We've already put out, I mentioned those state and county profiles back in March. They're all available at agcensus.usda.gov. And yeah, you can contact me if you need help finding something, or Jan can help out too. She's been poking around at it quite extensively.
Ben's the guru, take my word for it. I go to him, and it's nice that he is located right here in our state. He's right off Warm Springs Avenue in Boise, and yeah, you can go talk to him in person, or you can give him a call. But yeah, it's really great to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for your insight in our data. Appreciate you sharing it.
Love your data. Love your data. And the takeaway is agriculture is super important to Idaho, and it continues to be a base of our economy. No matter what people think, it is. Yeah. I don't know if Lindsay had any other questions in the chat or.
Yeah, so this is like a two-parter that came in. And I think either of you could probably answer this. It just says, what does the continued farm loss mean for our national and regional and local food supply? We seem to be doing fine producing enough food so far. Why? And can that continue?
Do you want to go with it, Ben?
Well, you probably have a better answer than that. I'm a statistician, okay? We work at compiling all this data, and the economists, like Jan, do a much better job at interpreting the data. But yes, I mean, I mentioned earlier, it's not good to see falling farm numbers and falling land numbers, and whether big or small. But farmers are being innovative. Another shout out to University of Idaho and other land grant universities that are doing research and getting grants. They'll use our data to apply for grants, and the research is going in to help benefit the farmers and getting rid of pests and improving yields and whatever needs to happen to keep the production going to feed the world. It's a challenge, it's an ongoing challenge, and it has been for many years. But like Jan mentioned, like some people might think farming is an old or ancient industry, but no, they're very up on technology and they're using AI too, trying to get that in their technology. And we asked a new question on this 2022 census about certain innovations they're doing, new conservation practices, and whether they're utilizing drones and things like that. And so another highlight from our data is we increased farm-related income by 23% from 2017, which is outside of commodity sales. So that was about $327 million from other sources of farm-related income. And then we already mentioned off-farm income. A lot of people are still doing off-farm work. But agritourism had an increase in Idaho over the last 5 years too. And so, farmers are getting innovative how to continue to survive financially themselves so they can continue to operate, but also to produce more. It's a good question, and you're not the only one that's asked it, and it's being asked, and it's Secretary Vilsack was asked that when the data was released, and I think he gave a pretty good answer. Not that there is a one and done answer, but it's something that needs to be addressed and discussed. And
one of the ramifications I think there is just we have some of the lowest food costs as a percentage of our income. And we can't continue to do that if we continue to lose farmland. Perhaps we can divert some of our exports to be more domestic and capture some of that savings if we lose farms too quickly. I tend to believe that the local movement is aiding in keeping awareness of how important farms are. And, just everybody's griping about prices of groceries at the grocery store. I mean, everybody. And I'm not saying I don't either. I do. But the bottom line is a lot of the costs aren't going to the farmer. They're going to marketing and transportation and storage, value added manufacturing. And so, we've got to keep our farm base here and intact. Losing a little bit more is maybe okay, but yeah, it's an important part of our economy, and it's an important part of our lifestyle.
Jan, I was hoping you could answer another question for me. So why does the non-farm jobs put out by the Idaho Department of Labor, why does that not include agricultural jobs?
I know, isn't that just such an odd phrase, non-farm jobs? Part of the reason that the non-farm jobs, which is our estimates that come out every month, and they estimate the number of jobs for the metropolitan areas, the state, and the nation. Part of the reason they don't include farm labor is that there's so much that is seasonal, and there's so many fluctuations that are caused by weather and natural disasters and various other things that impact farming, that it makes it really hard to do statistical work in which you're estimating jobs. So I think that was part of the reason they left it off. Certainly our unemployment insurance program, which is the administrative records in which we benchmark all jobs going forward. We go back and look at 2023 and benchmark with those administrative records. There's only a percentage of agricultural workers that qualify to be covered by unemployment insurance because they have to work a certain amount of time in a certain subsequent quarters, get certain payrolls before they're qualified. So, they weren't included. Non-farm just includes about 80% of the workers nationally. So, it's not everything, but it's a nice, quick, easy number to look at. And farming's more complicated. There's also that unpaid family part. And so they're really more interested in jobs that have wages. And there's a lot of those part-time and hobby farmers that we were talking about. All of those things just kind of dirty the waters. So the non-farm job program has just taken all that out and dispersed with it. And I don't know. I tend to like the administrative records better because it includes the ag workers. And there are about, gosh, I was going to estimate, we show 44,000 paid, but that doesn't mean they're all covered by the program. I'm kind of thinking it's probably closer to maybe around 35,000, but I'll look that up and I'll send it out I'm going to write an article about the Census of Ag 2022, and so I'll include it in there, the administrative records of agricultural workers versus what we show with the Census of Ag. There's lots of different sources, but good question.
Awesome. Thank you, Jan.
I'll add a little bit to that real quick too. Sources for the data, we're one of the big sources, and we work with the U.S. Department of Labor to actually conduct a quarterly survey on ag labor. And so the ag labor numbers actually come from our agency, NASS. So we've been talking a lot about the census data today, but we are doing monthly, quarterly, annual. We publish over 400 reports a year on various topics of agriculture, prices and production, acreage, yields, but also economics, farm finances, and labor, stocks on hands. And so you being here today, the data comes from the farmers in our efforts and farm businesses. So as you associate with the farm community and encourage continued response in these surveys we conduct, otherwise we can't provide the data. So,
data is only as good as the responses.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you're wanting farm labor data, we have it, but if people stop responding, it won't be available anymore.
For sure.